Further announcements. I am to report that I am in receipt of excuses from Senator Lucille Moore, who is overseas, and an indication of unavoidable lateness from Senator Kevin Boyce and Senator Tony Moore. And one additional announcement. It's my pleasure to welcome to the Senate our new chaplain, Reverend Wayne Curtin, who has been appointed by the Management Commission of Parliament at its last meeting. Reverend Curtin, we welcome you. We thank you for your blessings this morning, and we look forward to our sessions starting with your invocation. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Recognize in the chamber the presence of the
Mm-hmm.
officers.
Yeah.
And after that,
Mm-hmm.
minutes.
Yes.
Receive minutes.
Announcements. I recognize this morning the presence of the family of the late Prime Minister and former member of this chamber of our Parliament, the Right Honourable Owen Arthur. And I welcome Mrs. Arthur, Richard, Sabrina, just Sabrina, that's us, right? And not an official member of the family, but Anne, I think I recognize her behind the mask, but certainly part of the wider and extended family. Welcome you all to the session this morning, and we certainly at the beginning extend our deepest sympathy to each of you, and thank you very much for coming as we pay tribute in the next item.
Straight.
Yes.
To be confirmed.
Yes. Circulated, and they're available for confirmation.
Mr. President, I beg to move that those minutes of Wednesday, the 22nd of July, be now confirmed.
Seconder? Oh, that's a go. The question is? The question is that the minutes of Wednesday, 22nd of July, 2020, stand confirmed. Those in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. The minutes of July 22nd, 2020 stand confirmed. Next, the minutes of Wednesday, 29th of July, 2020 for confirmation.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the minutes of Wednesday, the 29th of July, 2020 be confirmed.
The question is that the minutes of Wednesday, July 29th, 2020 be now confirmed. Those senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. The minutes of our meeting of Wednesday, 29th July 2020 stand confirmed. We are also in receipt of the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, the 5th of August 2020 for confirmation.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the minutes of the meeting of Wednesday, the 5th of August 2020 be now confirmed.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, the August 20th, stand confirmed. Senator Tate.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just noticed an error on page 4 of those minutes, sir, about a quarter way down in the area of resumption in caps. It says, on resumption, Mr. President resumed the chair, and then it goes on to say, Mr. Speaker spoke. So I'm suggesting that Mr. Speaker be changed to Mr. President, and then I'll be fine. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. That's an amendment proposed.
President, I beg to move that the aforementioned minutes be confirmed as amended.
The question is that the minutes be confirmed as amended. Those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. The minutes of our meeting of Wednesday, the 5th of August, stand so confirmed.
You want to propose, you have to propose deferral of this.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
President, I'm commanded to lay the following documents. Securities Republic Wealth Management Limited Exemption Order 2020. Securities Maurice and Lang Exemption Order 2020. The annual report of the National Council on Substance Abuse for the year 2019.
Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions relating to the business or sitting of the Senate and moved by a minister.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of standing orders 45-2 and 22-1 for the remainder of today's sitting to allow us to complete our business as intended.
The question is that those standing orders so cited be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. The standing orders so cited stand suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the Public Service Appointments Bill 2020.
Second.
No seconder? Not necessary.
Oh, is there? Okay.
You have a lot of power.
First reading. Okay. The question is that the bill so cited be read a first time. Those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Congratulatory and/or obituary speeches.
Mr. President, at the beginning of this session, you welcomed the family of the late Professor Right Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur to this chamber. And I, at this point, have the uncomfortable role, I think you will well appreciate it, of rising to pay tribute to this great man. Sir, he possessed an air of absolute humility. He possessed a philosophy that hard work brought success. He possessed an outstanding intellect and a brilliant mind. He possessed an effervescent charm and an acerbic wit. He possessed a razor-sharp tongue and formidable debating skills. He possessed, Mr. President, an immovable commitment to ensuring a better life for all Barbadians and to ensuring that, as he often said, poor people should not remain poor. Mr. President, that was Professor the Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur, a remarkable man, a visionary leader, and an outstanding Prime Minister, and to whom I have the honor of paying tribute today. Mr. President, a lot of what I will say perhaps in sometime in the future, if I get time, will come in terms of my memoirs. But my first encounter with this great man occurred several decades ago. As a young medical student in Mona, I encountered this gentleman with his afro, with his sandals, because he always wore slippers at that time, who everyone called Tas. There's been some debate in terms of the origins of this Tas. I'm told that while he was at Harrison College, it had to do with his love for Tacitus. But certainly in Jamaica, some of us saw it as a related short for the Russian news agency, because at that time he displayed certain socialist tendencies. However, on Thursday evenings, it was the habit of Barbadian students to gather in a room in Chancellor Hall, and they call it the Cabinet. And they met every Thursday. I don't know, in terms of being curious, because certainly medical students never ventured to those things at that time, I was curious, and George Griffith invited me to this cabinet meeting. I remember you met people there like Lionel Weeks, Grantley Smith, there was Walter Black, Harry Blackett. There were a number of people who became quite prominent in the public service thereafter and held prominent posts in Barbados. And they were all gathered. And I was this young medical student. And Professor Arthur accosted me one evening as to what I was studying. And when I told him it was medicine, he was astonished. He was dismissive. He asked me what I was doing there, that medical students thought that they were the creme de la creme, and they didn't have to mix with ordinary folk. And we struck out a very interesting conversation, until he discovered then that I could speak to him about Frantz Fanon and the works of Aimé Césaire. It was a different story then. He was asking for me. I got the opportunity to go on outings with him. And I believe it was the beginning of a friendship that lasted from then until his recent demise. He left Jamaica in 1981, I believe it was. And we were in two different places, obviously. But then I came back. By then, he had been to the Senate, and he had been elected to the House of Assembly. And we struck up the friendship as we started Lyman, etc. together. And then there was that dreadful election in 1986, at the end of which there was a famous three blind mice. And Owen Arthur then became one of those three blind mice. That's why I speak about my memoirs, because then we started, and some members would have heard about it, what we would call I believe it was 6 weeks after the 1986 election, a cell meeting where we would meet on Fridays. And a group of young Barbadians from various walks of life and various activities and various backgrounds would gather. I believe Dr. Maynard might know, it used to occur in Lady Mead number 2, which was my resident as an intern and a junior doctor. And he addressed us on a number of occasions. And this was for those who feel lost at this time, the rebirth in terms of bringing new blood into the Barbados Labour Party after having suffered a horrendous defeat at the polls. Needless to say, time progressed, and in 1993, he became leader of the opposition. I well remember him preparing for his first budget reply as leader of the opposition. And with all that I've said about him in terms of his acerbic wit and his sharpened tongue, he was scared, Mr. President, that day. I well remember that day. We had to resort to certain chemical substances that are prescribed by doctors usually to get him in the state. And he delivered remarkably well. He became Prime Minister of Barbados in 1994 and remained there until 2008, 14 years. I believe he's the longest serving prime minister post-independence. And in that period, and I know, Mr. President, he marked up a compendium of achievements in transforming this country. There is no criticism of that. He developed an outstanding record in terms of economic and social progress during the 14 years, and it speaks for itself. He took over the reins of government during the period after falling the economic downturn as a result of the first Gulf War. By 1998, we had faced graduation in terms of the national financial institutions as a mid-level developed country, so we were not excluded from concessional funding and had to find developmental support, I will say loosely, on the open market. There was no concessional funding. Coming along with that was the whole issue of trade liberalization and the Uruguay rounds and the formation of the WTO, and following, of course, on to that, the heels of that would have been the demise of the sugar industry. But during the period of his stewardship, the economy of Barbados grew by 29%. Unemployment fell from 24.5% to 7.5%. There was reduction in poverty. Again, there was the UDC and the RDC. He was committed to urban renewal. He was ashamed of the poverty that still existed in Barbados. He felt that we should have the whole issue of pit latrines. He thought was that it was an enigma in our society at this point in time. And of course, there was increased property ownership. And all along, he maintained that he wanted to ensure that poor people were stopped from being poor. He always told us that this was his mantra. He recognized the great importance of education, and he championed the cause of education. And I think, Mr. President, you would remember, I wouldn't, in terms of the EduTech program, where $300 million was put into schools across Barbados, and part of his visionary leadership, not recognizing that now we would be talking about the utilization of technology and the whole introduction of computers into school at that time. But he was not only concerned about poverty and education and health and the economy. He was also concerned for the need for Barbadians to have a sense of a national identity, a feeling of self-worth, of who they were as a people. And so he was behind the creation of a pantheon of national heroes, which we now have. The whole issue of the Emancipation Day, the Commission of Pan-African Affairs, and indeed cultural affairs flourished during that period. Mr. President, I know you would want me to come to my invitation to Cabinet, where perhaps I met you for the first time. Believe it or not, it was September 9/11. The first jet had gone into the first tower, and the Prime Minister summoned me to a meeting in St. Thomas. There was a by-election at that time. I believe the Honorable the leader of the opposition, I believe he was involved in that by-election, but I don't recall specifically his role. What I do recall is that Mr. Arthur told me that morning, we were all fascinated and all struck by what was happening in New York, that he wanted me to join the cabinet. I think some of you would know that I was president of BAMP. I had been out there. I had been in opposition to a very popular minister of health. The doctors at the hospital had, with the exception of my good friend, Dr. Chris Maynard, who my good friend, Mr. Senator Chris Bernard, I believe he and one other individual, Mr. I know I shouldn't call names, Mr. Tony Harris, who wanted to hold off. And we had to take some industrial action at that point in time. And then it led to meetings with the Prime Minister at the time, and the involvement of the Barbados Workers Union to sort of bring us to, a common position in these matters. And there I was being asked to join the cabinet after having been so Yes, the Barbados Workers Union, what is a registered trade union, Mr. President. The honorable member is correct. Established. But I joined the cabinet, and I remember within the first 6 months, 9 months of being a minister, new minister, there was the issue of an awarding of a contract within the Ministry of Health. And there are some persons who are nameless and shall remain nameless who were putting pressure on this new minister that this contract should go to some entity. My PS was Mr. Weeks, and I told him the dilemma that I was faced with. A new member of cabinet being told or suggested to that something should go a certain way. That I had read the file, and I supported the position of the Tenders Committee. I was advised then that if I was being pressured, Mr. Weeks going the excellent PS he was, that I should go to the Prime Minister. I agreed. I called his office and went to see him. I remember distinctly. And it is something that I've carried with me throughout my entire political life. I spoke to Mr. Arthur that morning before cabinet and I explained the situation. And he asked me, what is your position? You are satisfied with the technical committee? I said yes. He said, well, go. He just dismissed me. He said, and he called me by name. He said, Jerome, you'll come into cabinet with your integrity. Make sure whenever you leave with your integrity intact. Mr. President, and that has stayed with me for my entire political career. He had something when you had problems that he would also, and I know that the President, you're familiar with this, the most difficult problem you had as a minister, he will tell you, face it and fix it. In other words, if you couldn't deal with it and get it resolved without his interference, then you knew that you were on ground that was not solid. And he will tell you with the most mellifluous language, you would understand to get it sorted out. But during that period, health was extremely difficult. But at that time, it was QEH. We were moving the transformation to a board of management. The matters related to HIV/AIDS, Barbados was the first country in the region then to introduce the provision of antiretroviral medication for persons who were suffering with HIV/AIDS, free of cost. We became the first country to establish a lab, and I think when I took that cabinet paper to cabinet, he was laughing, because I took a proposal for us to construct a lab with using 2 containers, state-of-the-art molecular lab, 2 containers outfitted. And we became the first country under his leadership to provide CD4 test, viral resistance, viral load, all of this was being done, containers at the time. And he really thought that he, in a situation with HIV/AIDS, that he should take leadership, that it needed the leadership of the Prime Minister, hence the AIDS Commission. He brought it under his office. The creation of Dr. Carol Jacobs became the czar, and later was supported in becoming the chair of the Global Fund. And so he really enjoyed this period in terms of what was happening in health, transformation to a board. And then, of course, we had the matters of Greenland. Mr. President, you well remember the issues of Greenland. I still had those, sanitation. And then he did a reshuffle and did a very strange thing. To everything that I had, he then added water and sewage and told me that he thought that those were all health matters. And easily, you felt then that the burden was probably going to be more than you could carry. But I believe that he felt that somewhere in there, because Mr. President, you know, he always cautioned you all that whenever I brought a cabinet paper, you should be looking for the veil. So those were the sort of confidence I believe he had in me at that time. He believed in Barbados. And he felt, as he said, and it was the slogan in 2008 manifesto, that we shouldn't aim for bronze or silver, but Barbados should aim all the time for gold. And was extremely proud, obviously, when we were ranked as the #1 developing country, and when Kofi Annan visited Barbados, and described Barbados as punching above our weight. I think historically remember how he took on the OECD and maintained that sovereign states had a right in terms of the taxation that is levied on residents or businesses in a country. And then he became not so popular with the U.S. when he had to speak his mind in terms of the U.S. airship right agreement, when he thought that they were coming too close and trying to take too much control within our region. Mr. President, he was an unrepentant regionalist and believed in CARICOM and enthusiastically took on his responsibility of having lead responsibility for CSME matters. He believed that an integrated Caribbean was vital to Barbados' economic survival. And I think we all recognize that in terms of our export, in terms of our trade, that without CARICOM, we are hopeless. And he withstood a lot of criticism for this in Barbados. I think we all remember that in terms of him speaking out in support of CARICOM nationals coming to Barbados and the whole feeling of insularity in Barbados, that he felt more for CARICOM countries than for Barbadians, and that is to be regretted. Remarkably, Mr. President, he still found time to lime, as you well know. He played hearts, he played whist, he played Kaluki. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Kaluki, but it's a game that is played in Jamaica, and we did this for hours. This was done for hours. And of course, dominoes. And I believe he loved to cook. And you, Mr. President, I believe you all cooked sometimes together. I'm not sure of the outcome and if you all will remain pliant after the meal. But he loved to cook. He played a lot of cricket early on, but in latter years, he enjoyed watching cricket. And of course, gardening. But with all of this, he was terrified of a simple injection needle. The smallest injection needle scared the living lights out of him. Mr. President, he was a voracious reader and always encouraged his ministers to read widely, especially as it related to their subject area and their areas of ministerial responsibility. And I believe that that should hold to this day for all ministers in any government. And Mr. President, I must say, and you would not expect me to sit down without mentioning the Barbados Labour Party and the role he played there. I must state that the enduring legacy of Professor Arthur in the BLP would be the influence and inspiration he engendered among the rank and file of the party, coming from the time when we had been defeated 24-3. The growth of the BLP under his leadership was phenomenal, and he attracted large numbers of young people to the party, and some of these are now holding government positions. After leaving active politics, his contribution to the economic well-being of Barbados and the region did not cease. He gave advice to several governments in the Caribbean. He was consultant to Bahamas, to St. Kitts Nevis, to Grenada, a number of them in terms of introduction of VAT to Belize. And he continued, and I'm speaking to some of his students now. They speak of his always willing to have them in his office to discuss economic matters and developmental economics. And for this, I believe the University of the West Indies in 2018 made him Professor of Practice Economics of Development at the Cave Hill. And Mr. President, in the last year, he had been quite extremely busy within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade with our plans for UNCTAD 15. He was made the chairman of the Global Commission on Trade in preparation for that, a commission which he chaired with a number of eminent persons from across the globe in preparation for the working papers for that conference. And I sincerely regret that for all the work he's done in preparation for that he will not be here next year when we expect to host UNCTAD 15. While doing that, he found time to develop a new industrial policy for Barbados, and indeed took over the chairmanship of LEAT. And more recently, he had been part of the Jobs and Investment Council, where he chaired the Industrial Transformation Group, which had at its remit and had been assigned the task of creating 20,000 jobs in Barbados in the next 24 months. Mr. President, I remember that last meeting. We sat next to each other. I believe Senator Cummings, she's not here, but she was also at that meeting. He was full of energy, full of ideas. This was as though this was the Owen Arthur that you had encountered in 1994 and 1999. It was almost like a rebirth, a rejuvenation of his spirit. He had responsibility for jobs and that, but in every area he was speaking. Agriculture, he had a love for agriculture. In terms of trade issues, I think we all knew that he felt that he was a trade specialist. That was his heart. And it was a memorable evening for me. We shared coffee, we shared sandwiches, we did a little gossiping, obviously. This is natural. Good gossip. Good gossip. And Mr. President, that is an evening I will always remember. It was, Indeed, Mr. President, he was a friend. He was a mentor, a classical scholar, a historian, a brilliant economist, a trade specialist, and an outstanding leader, and a committed regionalist. And as he would say, he was a good man. A good man. But often when he said so in relation to other people, it didn't last very long. But I say so for him. Indeed, he was a good man. Professor Arthur adored his family and will be sadly missed, obviously, by them and his many friends and associates. He loved to read Tacitus, who wrote that valor is the concept of death and pain. Professor Arthur truly displayed valor until the end. On behalf of my honorable colleagues and on my own behalf, I want to now extend sincere condolences to you, Julie, Sabrina, Richard, and a distant relative. You said he was your father, but I'm not sure. Of course, and to Leah, who is not here, and his sister Valmir, and the wider Arthur and Ben family. May he indeed rest in peace. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Senator Drakes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to also formally welcome you as our new President of the Senate, and I look forward to you presiding over our sittings. Sir, as the leader of government business gave his tribute, I almost feel cheated because of the extensive time that he would have known the Right Honorable Professor Owen Arthur. Mr. President, I met him just a little over 2 years ago, and I must admit that in our first encounter, I was extremely nervous because as a young economist growing up, coming up, and having been in his presence for the first time, it was as though you were in the presence of a living economic legend. That's how I felt in that moment. And although he had already left public life, I quickly realized as we got into the discussions that his intellect was still as sharp and as astute as it has always been. And he had this ability to dissect economic matters, complex economic matters, in a way that you were in awe. And all the while doing that, throwing a joke here and there to make you laugh. Sir, his love of country and for people, just people in general, was clearly evident. And he radiated a burning desire to always be informed on matters of national and regional affairs. And sir, as a young child growing up in Barbados, under his tenure as a prime minister, there was always not only a sense of economic prosperity and stability, but there was also a sense of security in the leadership of Barbados. Barbadians felt under Professor Arthur that they had a leader that they could trust. Sir, following that first meeting, I would go on to have several conversations with Professor Arthur about the economy. And in those conversations, sir, I would have the opportunity to sit and to listen to him, and he gave his experience and his knowledge freely, without prejudice. Sir, his advice ranged from public policy, and as a leader of government business just noted, his love for cooking and Caribbean delicacy. And I distinctly remember a conversation that we had where he was in complete and utter disbelief that someone so young could stir cuckoo. Sir, if my phone rang between the hours of 5 and 6 a.m., you better believe it was Professor Arthur calling me, ready to discuss the economic matters of this country. And sir, there was always this sense of concern, particularly in the latter days, this sense of deep concern on how to move Barbados forward, given all that had befallen us. Sir, from LIAT to government financing, to monetary policy, to trade policy, he discussed it all. And he always had a historical, an analytical, and a pragmatic analysis that all seemed to flow seamlessly. Sir, as we've heard time and time over, he was an economic powerhouse, full of facts, theory, and practicality. And his years of service to this country and region meant that his wisdom was bountiful. Sir, in our conversations, there was also always a sense of laughter, because he would tell me stories about his tutelage under former Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Tom Adams, and their stories and their adventures. And I would, in those moments, have a glimpse into a world of these larger-than-life political giants who seemed to intertwine a joy and exuberance for life, all the while carrying the burdens which leaders often bear. Sir, his command of the English language was exemplary. And unless you understood his wit and his humor, you could easily be offended by his choice of words when he described you. But that was a part of who he was and a part of his charm. Sir, he would always remind me and many others who he interacted with that we had a responsibility to continue the great legacy of statesmanship, which has always been a guiding and steady hand for Barbados' development path. He continually drilled home the importance of research. And he would always say to me, "Young Drakes, you have to read everything." And many a times he would call me and ask me if I'd read a report, if I'd read a document. And knowingly, he had already read it, and I was now looking for it, Mr. President. But that was the type of mentorship that he provided. And he understood the importance of sharing what he knew with younger professionals, because he himself was afforded that opportunity at a young age. Sir, we would share many an intellectual debate, and never once was there a hint of arrogance or an air of pomposity that came from him despite all he had achieved. What I will remember most about him was his humility while being that larger-than-life public person. Sir, great leaders, those who write their names on history's page, sacrifice the most for the people that they lead. They have the deepest passion and commitment to their duty, and they're the ones that carry the burden the farthest distance, and yet are still able to inspire, give hope and vision to the people. And he did all of this and then some. Mr. President, as Barbados grapples with the economic fallout of COVID-19, his words on July 4th of this year still ring loudly in my ears. He said to me, the Barbados economy is not ready for the calamity that is about to unfold. And sir, when someone like Professor Arthur, who has led this country for 15 years, says those words to you, you sit up and you pay attention. Sir, but he did not say that in defeat. He was always ready to assist. Sir, and as we continue to weather this COVID-19 storm, it is with great pain that he is not here with us to see it through. But sir, we must be bold, valiant, and undaunted in our efforts to achieve the economic transformation that is needed. One, to ensure that one, we survive this season, and two, we come out of this environment with a country that is ready to take advantage of the opportunities that will exist. Sir, most recently we heard the Minister of Finance in the Ministry of Finance state that in a best case scenario, the Barbadian economy will lose about $425 million in revenues. And given that revenues in the last few years have averaged about $3 billion, that is a best case scenario that we will lose 14% of our revenues. So even before we really and truly had an idea of the magnitude of the shock to the Barbadian economy, Professor Arthur had the foresight and the experience to know that the Barbadian economy was entering into what he called a corned beef and biscuit season. Mr. President, we have not just lost an intellectual titan, but someone who was extremely intuitive of the economic environment and was ready and willing and able to formulate policy to respond to that changing environment. Sir, he has left us in the physical plane, but his spirit will continue to live on in many of us, like myself, who he made sure to imprint his thoughts, his philosophies, all the while encouraging us to play our own unique part in Barbados' development. One thing that will stay with me about Professor Arthur is that he never wholeheartedly accepted an economic premise from the global community. He always had a sense of pride in constructing his own analysis to fit the Barbadian and Caribbean context. He has and will continue to shape the minds of many young Caribbean economists, showing through his life's work that the Caribbean intellect, nurtured by the University of the West Indies, can go toe-to-toe with any international academic or practitioner. Sir, as I stand, I'd like to extend my sincerest condolences to his family, to his friends, and to all Barbadians. To the Right Honorable Professor Owen Arthur, I thank you for your mentorship, I thank you for your sacrifice, and I thank you for your service. And may we all dutifully seek to live a life of purpose as he did. And sir, as we start this second session of Parliament, I end this tribute echoing the words of his last speech as a sitting member of Parliament, as Barbados seeks to move into a season where our moral, spiritual, and social convictions will be examined and challenged. And I think that the passage is appropriate. Sir, Philippians 4:8, verse 8 states, "Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, and whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things of a good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. I'm sincerely obliged to you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Drake. Senator Wiggins.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. President. And let me also welcome you as President of this Honorable Senate, and I wish you a very long and happy tenure. Also, I would like to express my deepest condolences to the Arthur family who are present here today, and to give you God's blessings and guidance, because it must be a really difficult time to lose someone that close to you. And I know how you feel, because I lost my youngest sister last year, and it is a feeling that you don't ever get over when you're very close to someone. So I would say I wish you all the love and the light for the future. Mr. President, I want to tell you the very first time I met Professor the Right Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur. I met him in the very early 80s when I used to work at the telephone company, and Mr. Williams was my boss. And we used to go to Queen's Park for lunch every day, and practically 5 days a week we ate lunch at Queen's Park. And Mr. Arthur and his cousin Hazeley Ben were there. This is 81, 82, very early 80s, where I met the Right Honorable Owen Arthur. And I would say to you that as a young person there and then, I was struck by his humility. And this is dealing with somebody on a one-on-one basis. He was not yet the Prime Minister of Barbados. And he talked about the things that he would like to do for his country, Barbados. And yes, the comment where everyone is saying that Mr. Arthur said he wanted to stop poor people from being poor, I know that is a fact. He was a very passionate man. When we met in those days, it was not adversarial politics, you know, given that he was with his cousin, Mr. Ben, who everyone here knows. It was not B versus D or anything like that. Mr. Arthur was interested in Barbados as a country. He was interested in moving Barbados to the next level. And of course, then we know he actually got involved in elective politics, and we all know the whole story surrounding the by-election in St. Peter. Mr. President, I would also say to you that growing up in those days, I had many friends in Black Bess. So I used to be in Black Bess very, very often. So I knew a lot of the people in St. Peter, and they revered Mr. Arthur. They revered Mr. Arthur. They would tell you that he was never too busy in terms of his clinics in St. Peter, because we had a few of them who worked with us at the telephone company. So that's how I knew, and then became friendly with a wider Black Bess population. And I would say to you that Mr. Arthur, when he started to speak on economics, which if you check some of the economists today, they always want to lord over you and speak, you know, make you feel as though they know more about economics than you. When you heard Mr. Arthur speak, Mr. Arthur was like teaching economics 101. He really dissected those concepts in economics where people like myself don't understand. And you would remember, Mr. President, even when he replied to budget speeches, people listened in because Mr. Arthur discussed the concepts of the budget. Many times a budget speech would be presented and people are not sure exactly what is going to happen. But when Mr. Arthur replied, he would dissect that budget paragraph by paragraph or line item by line item. And at the end of the day, the ordinary folk in the street, as they call them, would understand what that budget was meant to do. And a lot of people admired him for that. And we all know as well, it was spoken about many times in here, that he was a committed regionalist. And everyone would remember World Cup 2007, when Barbados, the West Indies won the bid to host the World Cup, there was the whole question of the reconstruction of Kensington Oval. I mean, there was a calypso. Mallet, I think, even constructed a calypso because of Mr. Arthur's commitment to CARICOM, to CSME, to hosting the World Cup and making the World Cup become the best event hosted by small island nations. He was really very committed to these processes. And because of that, he practiced what is now known, and I hope the leader of government business in his memoirs write about it, the whole politics of inclusion. The politics of inclusion. And the Right Honorable Mr. Owen Arthur practiced the politics of inclusion because sometimes I believe, I could be wrong, persons, including yourself, Mr. President, might know a lot better than me. I think Mr. Arthur was so committed to growing Barbados and making Barbados the best place that he headhunted people. He headhunted people, and if they're Dems, if they're Bs, if they're NDPs, or who they were, and he wanted everybody to come together around the table, similar now to what this current Prime Minister is doing with the jobs and then the investment councils and all the issues that she's dealing with. That sort of inclusiveness that some people would speak negatively of, Mr. President, but it is a great concept when you want to move a country from one level to another. That is a process that you have to go about in terms of moving the country to another level. And people speak to Mr. Arthur's humility, and it is so. I don't know, many of you would remember when games were playing at BET, the then BET. Mr. Arthur, as Prime Minister, would be at BET watching cricket, but guess where? On the floor, lying down on the grass, watching cricket. Lyman there and watching cricket. He was never up in the stands on, I'm the Prime Minister. But that is who he was. That is the Mr. Arthur that we knew and that we grew up with. And as I said, because I had a lot of friends in Black Bess, I knew him more from a personal standpoint than a political standpoint. And I could speak to all those issues that Mr. Arthur became. And he became the Prime Minister in 1994 after a successful no-confidence motion against his then teacher, because the Right Honorable Lloyd Erskine Sandiford taught him at Harrison College. And some other Harrison College sixth formers that I knew that also came from Courage Parry and went to Harrison College, taught by the same Right Honorable Prime Minister. They all talked about, and I can name a political scientist whom we all know, who is well known, and he told me a lot about Mr. Arthur being in sixth form with them and being taught by Sir Lloyd, and he told me how he got the name TAS, and the leader of government business explained that to you all. And they always saw him as someone who had a thirst for knowledge, a thirst for making things better, even from those school days at Harrison College. And Mr. President, there's a lot more that will be said about Mr. Arthur, but I just thought that I would get up and give my contribution and to also acknowledge those 14 years as Prime Minister. I remember a lot of things when you yourself, Mr. President, was Minister of International Business, when we had all those OECD issues, and the way that the then Prime Minister managed those OECD issues that still obviously have not been resolved today, because, as someone said, how is it that certain people are saying now Barbados wants to become a republic, never once did the United Kingdom say, when we were blacklisted by the OECD, that, oh, Barbados is part of us, let's, bat for them or something like that. It never happened. So, Mr. President, I remember the days when you were Minister of International Business, how hard that fight, and another former senator fought to put Barbados back on the map. And these are records of history that a lot of young people must learn today, those 14 years when he was Prime Minister. And he really put Barbados on the map. He did a lot for Barbados, both politically and economically. And he made sure that young persons had that opportunity to move up the ladder. And you were a young person back then, Mr. President, and he appointed you, still young, and a young person back then whom he appointed, all in the name of the progress of Barbados. So he's someone who is to be revered. We all have our faults, we are all not perfect, but he's a man who is to be revered. And any monuments or any lasting memories that the Prime Minister chooses that he should be remembered by, he should be remembered because he was a committed regionalist, And as I said, it's the same policies that this Prime Minister is also introducing in terms of bringing CARICOM together as one group. I remember when this Prime Minister was chairman of CARICOM earlier this year, every time she spoke in the international media, she never said Barbados, she said CARICOM. She was speaking as one block, so she carried on that legacy of making sure that CARICOM was part of the international process and to be recognized. So in closing, Mr. President, let me thank you for the opportunity, and let me once again extend love and light to the Arthur family and to the wider extended family in the constituency of St. Peter. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Senator Dr. Holder.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and let me join with those senators before me to offer congratulations to you and to say welcome to the Senate chamber. I wish also to join in paying tribute this morning to Professor the Right Honorable Owen Arthur, a man who I first met in the early 2000s as he was chairman of the Barbados Labour Party back then. And I, representing my branch and a member of the party, like so many of us in this chamber today are, even on that side, still members of the Barbados Labour Party. And my initial encounter, Mr. President, I must say left an indelible impression on my mind and on my purpose and the definition of purpose, Senator Drakes. Because I realized he was an individual full of wisdom and intelligence, yet humble in the discharge of his responsibility. I'll also add very quickly that he was a person that appeared to be one who wanted to get things done and get things done quickly, even in chairing those National Council meetings. That came across in his command of the council and how he would lead the various activities and programs of the party. He wanted to get things done. He didn't appear to be someone that, was contented in just talking for the sake of talking, but he was an action-oriented person. And that, too, impressed me because, I pride myself as well in being a results-oriented individual. So he left that indelible impression from the very beginning of my encounter with the late Owen Arthur. In defining purpose, Mr. President, I moved on then to play an active role in two key organizations, and might I add, two key sectors within our community. And on reflection, I have to admit that Professor Arthur played a role in that process. As I stand now, today, there are two plaques in these two organizations that bear the name of Professor Owen Arthur. One is the City of Bridgetown Credit Union on Broad Street, where, Mr. President, he would have in 2000, as Minister of Finance, officially opened that new building on Broad Street. COB was the first credit union to move to Broad Street. And the impression is there to this day of Professor Arthur working as he did with the board at the time to launch that particular initiative at the bottom of Broad Street. And the other plaque is in the lobby of the Small Business Association of Barbados, where in 1995, in December, he would have officially opened the secretariat of that organization, and again would have helped through a number of policy initiatives I'll speak to just briefly in a moment, would have helped to assist that organization in making its mark here nationally and, might I add, regionally on the behalf of the MSME sector. And so, Mr. President, those two organizations and the work that he would have done for the sectors that they represent would have, in a sense, influenced even my own perspective and the work that I now do in those two sectors. Many of you would recall that in 1996, Professor Arthur would have focused on the credit union movement here in Barbados and introduced a number of policy initiatives to be able to grow that sector. I will, without apology, even suggest that today, with 200,000 odd members in the credit union movement in Barbados, and assets under management of $2 billion, would have been achieved in great measure because of the policy prescriptions of Professor Arthur as Minister of Finance as he was back then. Many would recall the allowance at the time in 1996 or prior was just about $1,800. Professor Arthur understood and would have operationalized this mantra that we keep talking about: poor people should not remain poor. He understood the importance of incentivizing persons to save. And so he raised that threshold to $3,000. And so annually, many of us, Senator Franklin could identify with this as a member of the Public Workers Credit Union as he was at the time, and many of us in the room, many of us, when we had that extra $3,000 at the end of a year, and even if we didn't have it, we saved towards it. Why? Because we were able to make that deposit in the credit union. Obviously realize a return, a satisfactory return on it, but it helped us, it incentivized us to save. And this was significant. This, in my view, helped ordinary Barbadians to put aside something to save annually in the credit union movement. Now, I'll admit that that frugal spirit has always been there in the culture of Barbadians. But the credit union movement provided now an opportunity for you to take those monies that you may have, saved at home, and you had now a model, a methodology by which you can place those savings and you can earn a satisfactory rate of return. But he didn't stop there. That was 1996. He didn't stop there. Later on in 2007 or thereabout, he raised it from $3,000 to $10,000 so that you had the opportunity now to set aside about $10,000 annually across a range of products, because there was a registered retirement savings plan, there were a kind of a mutual fund, if you will, and other instruments that were introduced that allowed you, Mr. President, to save annually in your credit union. And it helped not only Barbadians to save, but it helped with the development and the growth of a number of small credit unions, the big ones too. Because annually, scores of Barbadians now were able to place their deposits there. And I am satisfied that when you look at the credit union movement and the growth that we have seen in the last decade to two, that this in large measure was realized because of the work of Professor Arthur. He understood, Mr. President, that you have to enfranchise ordinary people. You have to incentivize them. And he understood the importance of appropriate policies, and he put those policies in place to be able to help ordinary Barbadians to be empowered. And we really must commend him for that. And I stand here, Mr. President, as a member, as a credit union leader, saying thank you to Professor Arthur for what he did for the credit union sector in this country. But it didn't stop there. The brevity of my contribution today has no reflection at all on any notion that what he did could easily be summed up in my short contribution. No notion at all. I move to the next sector, and that is the small business sector. I'll spend a little more time here with your indulgence, Mr. President. Because in my professional life, I have had the opportunity to work, I'll say, with about 4 prime ministers. And again, I'll make the bold statement that I've not seen any to date that understood the micro, small, and medium enterprise sector like Professor Arthur. Understood its contribution to economic and social development like the late Right Honorable Owen Arthur. I challenge anyone to suggest otherwise, Mr. President. Professor Arthur did not just talk it. As I said, there's a plaque in my office that bears his name. Because he understood, here is an association, fledgling as it was at the time, Mr. President, in the early 1990s. We know how most organizations, most associations, find their teasing process, how they go through that process. Mr. President, fledgling as it was at the time, but he understood the significance of having an organized group of men and women who can lobby on the behalf of the sector, who can introduce programs to help with the capacity building and development of the sector. And it was Professor Arthur in 1995 that took the decision to give that fledgling organization a small subvention. Because with the best will in the world, I don't care how you try to crunch the numbers, you could not have had the kind of subscription contributions that could support a secretariat. No, because those small and micro firms paid about $200 a year. You would have to have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of them to really finance your operation. So he understood this, and he gave that organization a small subvention back in 1995. Mr. President, that subvention, might I say here this morning, allowed that organization to hire professional staff and to begin to organize itself in a professional manner, to get a secretariat, procure the equipment, and begin to invest in research and begin to do the things that were necessary to adequately and effectively represent a sector. That was the Lego that Professor Arthur gave that organization. That is what we've come to know him for. He was that kind of individual. But it didn't stop there. It went beyond just giving a subvention annually to supporting programs, being an advocate, if you will, even in his own right, in entrepreneurial development, in our people getting involved in this type of enfranchisement and encouraging it. I'm sure many of us would recall that there was a particular business man that had a popular retail outlet, ran into trouble. He moved to Hackett Hall, and he had a sprawling property there in Hackett Hall. But he ran into trouble. Professor Arthur came to his rescue, and others like him. Because with all of the talk now about Black Lives Matter, Mr. President, and I support black businesses, let us never have the conversation and leave out the contribution that Professor Arthur would have made in supporting the development of black businesses in this country. He came to the assistance of not only that particular supermarket, but several others, because he was committed to entrepreneurship as an enfranchisement model, especially amongst ordinary black people in this country. That was the legacy of Professor Arthur. But I go further. In addition to supporting this organization, getting the secretariat in place, giving them the capital to be able to hire staff and put programs in place. Look at some of the other things that he did, even from a legislative perspective. Barbados was one of the first countries in CARICOM to have a Small Business Development Act. 1999, again amended in 2006. One of the first, Mr. President, because he understood the importance of using the legislative apparatus available to us to enable business development, to enable economic development. Several other CARICOM states then followed after, Mr. President, in adopting the model. And within that Small Business Development Act, there was something called Approved Small Business Status that he introduced. Why? To be able to help those small firms who qualified for that approved small business status to pay a much lower corporation tax annually. But he didn't stop there, Mr. President. He went further in the introduction of guarantee schemes administered by the Central Bank of Barbados, again for small firms to be able to access credit. The Fund Access and the Enterprise Growth Fund were established in the 1990s to fill the void left, as we know, following the demise of the Barbados Development Bank, offering low-interest loans, single digits, I'm talking about 4 and 6%, low-interest loans to small firms that they can access the much-needed credit to start their business, to pursue that dream that they had. Even equity funding, he was actually the first to understand and appreciate the importance of equity funding and what it could possibly do in helping to give us a diversified market for the access to capital. Mr. President, I can go on because he has done so much. He's done so much in that period of time. No wonder the unemployment rate moved from about 26% down to about 6%. And we speak to that unemployment rate dropping significantly and not having an appreciation, I think, sometimes, to the fact that because he understood economics, yes, Senator Drake, he understood the macro picture, he was able to create an entrepreneurial class in this country that helped with bringing the unemployment down to the rate that it did, because many persons were incentivized to pursue entrepreneurial activity, to start their businesses. we would recall that during the early 1990s, when there was the 8% cut and thousands of civil servants were sent home, that when he came on the scene in 1994, he understood the significance of creating the policy instruments now that would provide an opportunity for many of them who had the entrepreneurial talent to pursue that as a revenue-earning measure. It reduced unemployment, yes. It created economic activity. It created social enfranchisement, and thus helped with the transformation that we saw in that 14-year period. The man was a genius. And as we study history, any of us who study history understand that in every season that we go through, that the countries of the world go through, that our civilizations go through them, there's always a man or woman that emerges at the right time to be able to address the developmental issues, to be able to address whatever the issues are confronting the peoples at the time. This is across our history. It happens in religion, it happens in economics, it happens, social issues. And I believe that Professor Arthur was just that for that season. Mr. President, in more recent times, 2015 to be precise, I had the opportunity again to interact and interface with Professor Arthur. 2015 is the organization I have the pleasure to lead was celebrating Small Business Week as it was known, it is known. He was invited to deliver the feature address at one of the events. During that year, we also had Vice Chancellor Sir Hilary Beckles. And I remember as he came in, he was coming in, the ushers were bringing him in, and he said, but you have to be really great to get Sir Hilary and myself in the same week. And I smiled. I said, well, but, sir, you understand it also well. We needed great minds during this week to help us to chart a path for the sector. And he came and he challenged us as a sector, as a community. He spoke to his vision for the small business sector in this decade and beyond, the use of technology and innovation and how this was going to be the game changer for a buoyant sector in the future. Little did he know, 5 years later, there would be COVID-19. And all of what he said back then in 2015 in that speech actually has come to pass now. The prescriptions that he gave back then are the prescriptions that we have been discussing in the last few months, and how do we position ourselves to be able to cope, to be able to survive in this post-COVID environment. And then again in 2019, again more recently, he was the chairman, as the leader of government business would have alluded to, of the Industry Transformation Committee established within the Ministry of Industry and International Business. And I serve on that task force, Mr. President. And I got the opportunity again to be up close with him. And he would call me Miss Small Business. Miss Small Business, Miss Small Business. Miss Small Business, remember what I did for your organization, I'm the one that started the equity program that you have. And, and I said, yes, sir. And I felt during those sessions, Mr. President, and I could identify with Senator Drakes with this point, I was enamored, that's the truth. Still at the wisdom that he espoused. Like the Apostle Paul, sitting at the feet of Gamaliel. That's how I felt. Sitting at Professor Arthur's feet, as it were, during those committee sessions and hearing him again, mind as sharp as it was back in the early 2000s when I first met him at National Council. Still speaking to the kind of industrial policy that is needed for Barbados. And he would look around at me all the time and say, any industrial policy is really a small business policy, And again, Mr. President, it would make good reading, I think, and research for all of us to read his last piece of work in that policy that he proposed to the government. You'll be moved, really, that in that last work, again, the demonstration was there of someone who understood how to use policy to really inform national development. He understood the productive sectors and the work that the productive sectors need to make now to transition the Barbados economy. I tell you, Mr. President, the words of Mahatma Gandhi, I think, best epitomize the life of the late Professor Arthur as I close. He said, the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service for others. And I am satisfied that from what I saw with the credit union movement and the small business sector and the work that he did, Professor Arthur definitely found himself and his calling in the work that he did in service of others. And so to you, Julie, and family, I join with the others in offering condolences, and I pray that he continues to rest in peace and rise in glory. I'm obliged, sir.
Senator Sands.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, let me congratulate you on your recent appointment and extend a warm welcome to you to this honorable chamber. I would also like to extend my deepest condolences to the family of Professor Arthur, who is with us here today inside of the chamber. Now, Mr. President, I rise to join in paying tribute to Professor Arthur, Barbados' fifth and longest-serving Prime Minister. He holds that post, that title. But that is merely one in the endless list of achievements that he has accomplished during his tenure, during his political and academic career. During his tenure as Prime Minister, I would have been in primary school and secondary school, because that would have ranged from 1994 to 2008. And while I may not have been a student of politics at the time, I was nonetheless conscious of the social and economic transformation that Barbados would have gone through under his stewardship, whereby he would have wrestled unemployment down to historical levels, and he would have created almost 30,000 jobs for hardworking Barbadians. Now, while it's an undisputed fact that Professor Arthur has made significant contributions to the development of Barbados, it is his love for the Caribbean which illustrated the true measure of the man, some coined the greatest statesman of the 20th century Caribbean. Professor Arthur, was passionate about regional integration, and this was illustrated through his tenure where he constantly advocated for the survival of LIAC and also for the Caribbean Court of Justice, becoming the final court of appeal in the Caribbean, not just for Barbados, but for the Caribbean. His commitment to regional integration has been praised by all and sundry, and he has been recognized, in the words of Dr. Ralph Gonzalez, as the chief architect, advocate, and intellectual guide of CARICOM single market economy. Now, notwithstanding his political and academic accolades and the admiration that he would receive both regionally and locally, Professor Arthur remained humble, friendly, and approachable. Now, I recall being present at a social event that my grandfather, the late Duncan Carter, would have hosted. Both BLP supporters and DLP supporters were present and in attendance. I witnessed Prime Minister Arthur, as he then was, interface with almost every single person at that event, B's and D's and the like. And he even sat down at the children's table and engaged us in political conversations. To this day, I don't know what he was talking about, I just knew this was Barbados Prime Minister, and he was willfully sitting down at the children's table talking to us as though he knew us from before. That stuck with me throughout my life. The legacy of Mr. Arthur should be an inspiration to all young aspiring politicians. His iconic statement of face it and fix it epitomizes the nature of the man. Mr. Arthur has definitely left an indelible mark on the political landscape of Barbados and the Caribbean. Professor Arthur, the economist, the regionalist, will truly be missed. And I do pray that he may continue to rest in peace and rise in glory. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Sands. Senator Minard.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I too wish to welcome you to this chamber. I want to welcome you by saying to you something in Latin. And it says, non sibi sed omnibus. For those who are not Latin scholars, Mr. President, it means not for ourselves, but for all. Mr. President, I too, even though I have never met the professor, the Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur, except for a brief moment when I witnessed the sharpness of his tongue and I quickly exited the room because it did not involve me and it did not need to be there. But I wish to comment on one aspect of his work, and that is with HIV/AIDS, Mr. President. In May 2001, the National HIV Program moved from the Ministry of Health to the Office of the Prime Minister. And it came about after a meeting which the Prime Minister attended with CARICOM and PAHO. And at that meeting, PANCAP was set up. And he created the National HIV Commission and appointed an AIDS czar, Dr. Carol Jacobs, who did sterling work and later served in this honorary chamber. Mr. President, he recognized the link between HIV/AIDS and development. And he recognized that if this work was not done, it could de-develop Barbados because it affected those who we needed most, the young, productive people. And while the Ministry of Health continued to look after the health of these people, the National HIV Commission dealt with the psychosocial aspects of disease. And he became chair of the Global Fund. And that was the turning point. Antiretroviral drugs became free and continue to be free. And it affected the present at the time and the future. And it brought the rate of mother-to-child transmission to almost zero. And it was visionary. Mr. President, he also had the vision to inject capital into hemodialysis. Senator Walcott, I believe, was the minister at the time, and we now have a vibrant, even though not as extensive as it should be, a vibrant hemodialysis program that has saved many lives and continues to save lives. And that's to his credit. But he recognized competence, Mr. President. And I recalled when, in 1995, and Senator Walcott has vivid memories of this, when there was a change in the management structure at the QVH. And later, one of those persons who was removed was appointed as the first CEO to transition the hospital. And that was because Professor the Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur recognized competence, and he rewarded it. Mr. President, I believe that our position today would not have been the same had the important attention and work in HIV in medicine not been done. And I extend my condolences to the Arthur family, and I believe that what we have to do is to continue to build on the successes. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Minard. Senator Dr. Springer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I first wish to extend congratulations to you and to welcome you to this August chamber. I truly look forward to working with you as we engage in the business of making the laws to ensure the peace, the order, and the good governance of this country. Once again, I welcome you. Mr. President, while I did not know Professor the Right Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur personally, his ubiquitous influence is unquestionable. His legacy is one of excellent stewardship, and his outstanding contribution to this country, to the Caribbean community, and internationally, all attest to this fact. In addition to having the honor of being the longest serving Prime Minister in the history of Barbados, he proved himself a master development economist, a defender of self-determination, defender of democracy, a political strategist, a diplomat, an academic and a thinker, and as was mentioned by almost everyone who spoke this morning, a staunch regionalist. This nation benefited from his devotion and his assiduousness as he steered Barbados on a path of development and growth over the course of 14 years. And it is without a doubt that his contribution serves as pillars for the development of the nation, or development of Barbados as we know it today. Mr. Arthur was highly respected for his academic acumen and vast experience. And this led him to be sought out by governments and by organizations as a consultant, not only as an economist, but also as a statesman. Mr. Arthur distinguished himself in a number of different areas, and many of them were mentioned here today. But above all else, I believe Professor Arthur was a regional integrationist. He believed in Caribbean oneness. And that's why I chose to focus on that aspect of his life this afternoon. Because I think throughout the Caribbean and indeed the world, that is what Professor Arthur would be known as, a regionalist. I'm also convinced that Mr. Arthur has left us a template for development, not only Barbados, but for the entire Caribbean, on how to move forward in a post-COVID world. I believe so. Professor Arthur was one who represented the Caribbean, Barbados and the Caribbean, in different fora, both regionally and internationally. You can think of the OAS, the Commonwealth, the UN, and the list goes on and on and on and on. But regardless of where he spoke, there was one thing you can say about Professor Arthur, is that he was a champion of the integration process and a strong defender of the interests of small island developing states like Barbados and those in the region within the international arena. He was the quintessential regionalist who understood the evolving global political economy. He also understood, quite aware of the ensuing dislocation for states such as ours, and the special urgency that regional integration would play in helping us to navigate these treacherous waters. His understanding of using regional integration to give power to our voice and to enhance our competitiveness went beyond just a focus on our domestic economy. Mr. Arthur also focused on those existential threats that brought into question the fundamental viability of states such as Barbados. He often spoke of systemic challenges to the viability of states as functioning socio-economic, ecological, political systems. And these include an intersection of climatic, economic, social, and political developments. You would hear him speak of climate change, transnational crime, food security, other governance challenges, and perhaps more importantly, the decline in regional industries. One thing you can say about Professor Arthur is that he believed deeply that all these challenges could be addressed by a coordinated regional response. In light of this, Professor Arthur was instrumental in the creation of the CSME. And he was of the view that the region should act and respond as one voice on the international stage. When he was quoted as saying, "I have no doubt that the Caribbean regional integration represents the most effective means by which the individual economies of our region can be successfully integrated into the ever-changing global economic system." And it's my belief that hopefully one day his dream of a single economy will also be realized. Because based on what he would have said, which is that he believed that its implementation would have a transformational effect on the regional society and it's worthy of being pursued. He believed that it would have had a transformational effect on the regional society, and this was worthy of being pursued. But he was the first to admit that with the best will in the world, immediate gains from this pursuit will be small and they would be unevenly distributed. As an outstanding economist and an expert practitioner on the development of small island economies, Mr. Arthur was able to formulate and share a vision for Caribbean people that was etched in a stance of confidence and a deep belief that with hard work, that anything was possible. As he sought to see the Caribbean prosper, Professor Arthur was constantly confronted with developmental issues and formidable challenges that most small island developing states face. But his profound knowledge of economics, coupled with his lived experience, molded him into a resounding voice on development issues, especially for small, vulnerable economies like Barbados and those in the Caribbean. He was a voice for those in the global arena. Despite the challenges of size, Mr. Arthur constantly reminded us that our collective voice is big and must be heard in every global arena and at each international forum. And he encouraged persons to go there and to speak. But at the same time, and my colleague Wiggins alluded to it, he had the ability to break down things. And he enjoyed using his deep knowledge of economics and translating that into practical realities, practical things that the everyday man, the everyday person in the street could understand and could relate to. In his pursuit of development, he prioritized people over material considerations. And as a result, was responsible for running the best black society in the world. These are not my words. This was said of Professor Arthur. At the local level, he sought to improve the lives of every Barbadian, of our average Bajans, but particularly those from the privileged rural communities like the one in which he was born. I know that the leader of government business will have mentioned the importance placed on education, and he spoke to EduTech. But Professor Arthur was also known for saying that there should be a university graduate in every household. And we as young, budding politicians in here could appreciate the importance of that. It is admirable that despite his esteemed status, he was still, in every sense, that boy from St. Peter, who had never lost his common human touch. And that is a lesson that we will all do well to learn. For the residents of St. Peter, if you ask them, they will tell you that Professor the Right Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur was first and foremost a hometown boy. He was Owen, the guy who play cricket and who would slam a dunk, in the shop with his friends. That's who he was. And I would just share a story that my wife shared with me some few years ago. Speak to the character of the man. She was parking her car in Queens College car park some time ago and was struggling to get it in between a fairly tight spot. And this gentleman came out from nowhere and gave her some directions, just come back a little more and shift around a little bit to the left. And she, looking out, seeing who it was, and coming from Africa, my wife is from Africa, where when leaders or former leaders, if they're going to the supermarket, the entire supermarket is closed. Everyone is asked to leave so that those persons can have the entire supermarket for themselves. And here it was that a former prime minister of this country was in the car park alone, directing her, poor little her, directing her into a parking space. That was a fascination for her. She was amazed. But such was the man. I would have seen him in the supermarket from time to time in the line buying his items just like anybody else. These are things that we take for granted in Barbados because in other places it would never happen. Never happen. But that was Owen Arthur, if I can call him that. That was who he was. Coming from a rural constituency, he was motivated by a special determination, and those are his words, a special determination to demonstrate to the world that a poor boy, if he was willing to put in the work, could rise to any height. And that is what Mr. Arthur proved. Now, it is believed that the greatest legacy a man can leave behind is his ideas. His ideas of regional integration and the many other areas in which he distinguished himself are visionary. And we as Barbadians and as Caribbean people can and will continue to use those ideas that were alluded to today by my colleague here and the other persons who spoke earlier. We use them to strengthen the Caribbean and the Caribbean nations as we go forward for decades to come, I believe. Decades. We will still be drawing on the work and the research on the guidance of the Right Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur. Lastly, from a personal viewpoint, Mr. Arthur, his love for his country and his unrelenting effort to build this country for the betterment of his people are lessons that persons such as myself will hold close to my heart. His legacy speaks to what is best in all of us. And it awakens not only our responsibility to self, but our responsibility to others and our responsibility to country, and by extension, to region. At this time, I would also like to take this opportunity to extend deepest condolences to his family, and at the same time to thank them for lending him to us here in Barbados and the region. He truly was a colossus. May he continue to rest in peace. I'm obliged, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Springer. Senator Boyce.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, and welcome to what, coming out of the throne feast, sir, is scheduled to be a most historic sitting of this honorable house, sir. I wish to extend welcome, of course, to the family of our late Prime Minister. And I rise, like fellow senators in here, on behalf of a thankful nation. And you may not be aware of this, but while it's not apparent from my slight inflection of tone, I myself derive from that northern root of mile and a quarter. And there is a historic tie that binds the families. And a point that I have made in this place, and I'm glad I get the opportunity to repeat it, is that the Barbados that we enjoy allows persons to come from wherever and make a contribution. And that contribution is valued not based on where they're from, but on a simple act of meritocracy. My friends will tell you that I claim the North. They somewhat dispute that, but I still do it willingly. So our families would have mingled in the playing fields of Ben Hill Quarry and All Saints. And my interaction would have been limited to observations of the wit that was referenced several times so far today. I recall, and I believe that Senator Walcott can attest to this, that during one of the elections in which my father was running for Christchurch South, the late Prime Minister stipulated that he wondered why a man would move to the opposite side of the island from St. Peter to run in Christchurch. And yet, despite this, and all the other commentary which would flow back and forth, I have several recollections of what I can say showed the late Prime Minister bridging this political divide. And perhaps it's, if we label it political divide, it may capture the essence, because in my personal belief in Barbados, there is less an ideological or philosophical divide between those who enter the huskings to seek elective support. Firstly, and I will go through a list of very personal recollections to try to give perhaps a different layer to the conversation and the discussion we're having today. I recall at a joint celebration with my father that we were enjoying some cigars. And when I inquired where the source of the said cigars were from, Mrs. Arthur, I don't know if you're aware, but it turns out that they were a gift from the late Prime Minister. Secondly, there was a sitting similar to this where tribute was being paid to my late grandmother. My father at the time was the leader of government business in the other place. And the late Prime Minister spoke very well of my grandmother, even though she would certainly not be described as a supporter. And this is the class of politician that we generate in this country. And this is the class of politician that we should seek to strive to emulate. This partisan practice that threatens to gulf our shores should be resisted and should be embraced as we look upon this legacy that we all seek to herald. I know it is the season, and I know blades are sharpened, and I know sides are entrenched. But let us seek in these moments. Let us seek in these moments, Mr. President, if we can aspire for something greater. Maybe I'm an idealist, maybe ostentatious in terms of his description, but let us strive to fulfill the legacy which the late Prime Minister has set forth. Certainly also, Mr. President, you will forgive me if I divert my attention to the guests in this house, sir. Certainly also, Mrs. Arthur, through you, Mr. President, I have recollections of attempting to study at university and hearing stories that the then Prime Minister was visiting the Jamaican students on hall. There were some male Jamaicans in one of the buildings, and your husband would find himself there to engage in different topics. I don't know if similar to what Senator Walcott would have spoken about. And so I also recall express pleas being made for the Barbados manufacturers to increase their competitiveness. This is the impression that I had of the man. I can't go to lofty speeches. All I can give you, and all I seek to do today, is to give you an impression of what an ordinary Barbadian would have thought, an ordinary Barbadian would have appreciated with regard to this individual who had such an impact on us all. Now, I would have started in a work environment where there were several benefits to take advantage of in terms of the investment climate. I certainly tell my associates to this day that when I started work, you could have put money in the credit union, you could have put money in a retirement fund, and you could have put money in other forms of investment which would allow you to get a tax ease. These, I believe, were also a direct benefit of the late Prime Minister. And in shaping the personal impact of the gentleman, I recall on a trip in Grenada that our driver, a gentleman by the name of Pirate, when he discovered that we were Barbadian, exclaimed in joy that we had to be nice people because he had to drive the late Prime Minister. And in driving the late Prime Minister ended up in his house to get food with him, Pirate, on one of their runs. So this, to me, Mr. President, captures an individual who we have all heard and been described as someone who, despite the statesman character, also had a very personal legacy and a personal connection. The question is, when we say these words and when we say these accolades, do we follow that example, Mr. President? That's the question. Now, sir, my personal interaction with the former Prime Minister, the late Prime Minister, I saw him shopping in the Warren supermarket. It seems to be the spot if you wanted to approach it. I don't believe that he was the Prime Minister at the time, and I went up and introduced myself to him and indicated that I was someone who listened to what he had to say and indicated my appreciation. Later on, while taking part in the IVLP program with the government of the United States, I was surprised and honored to discover that the late Prime Minister, along with our current Prime Minister, were also graduates of the program. And in that regard, one of the legacies which I got out of that experience was that we as Barbadians need to build our own temples and we need to tell our own stories. In so doing so, we perhaps consider what Pantheon in terms of what we can do to suitably honor the late Professor, Right Honorable Owing Seymour Arthur. Now, to aid in this speech, Mr. President, this will be your first interaction with me, so I tend to draw on resources when I am outside of my depth. So what I would have done in this circumstance was to poll those who would have been somewhat closer as we attempt to paint this mural of the late Prime Minister. And I'll start with Sir Henry Ford, who was then leader of the opposition through what Senator Walcott has described as the three blind mice era. Politics can be so harsh. It can be so harsh. And Sir Henry has this to say, that he got to know him through Tom. Sorry, former Prime Minister Tom Adams. And when the party lost the election, there were only 3, and they were all very close. Apparently, there used to be gatherings by Sir David or Sir Henry or the late Prime Minister Owen. But Sir Henry did tell me that he was the brightest out of the 3. He described him as very analytical, very far-sighted, very used to love to lecture them about the world economy and running the country. And he spoke to his great foresight. Sir Henry indicated that he mixed with people quite easily and always helped those most in need. He helped rebuild the party. As Senator Walker has indicated, that might give hope for those who may need a little wind in their sails at this time. And look how far they have come. And he would plan for the upcoming sessions in Parliament. And the viewpoint at the time, Sir Henry tells me, is that he was the obvious successor. From the wilderness, it seems, you can find a way home. Those who have ears will hear. Now, the assistance of the party faithful was always there, and Sir Henry actually told me that the late Prime Minister Owen Arthur would not only limit his comments to the economy, but would challenge Sir Henry on the law. This was the essence of the man. In the middle of this, in terms of my research, I also spoke with Mr. Gregory Nichols, who was appointed a senator by Professor Arthur in 2000. I also was at school during this period, and we were shocked, if not amazed, by Gregory's selection as a senator in terms of the Prime Minister's confidence in the youth of the nation. I think one which is echoed by the appointment of Senator Sands within these chambers. And Mr. President, I was told by Mr. Nichols that late Professor Arthur's leadership style was one that wanted to win the battle of ideas. Apparently, he didn't hold to a philosophical line. He was pragmatist, but focused on how best to get it done and execute it properly. Very big on policy formulation and statecraft as an art. Apparently, there's an expression, sir, I'm sure you and Senator Walker would know it, that let me make sure I have it correct, public policy should pass the test of reasonableness. I don't know if you heard that in cabinet, sir. Mr. Senator Walker is nodding appreciatively. He was methodical and would plan it. He would plan it from the back, from forward to go back. In other words, he would see the end where they wanted to reach and then work it way as to how you would reach there. And there's one anecdote which I wish to have recorded in Hansard. Apparently, the late Prime Minister was an engaging conversationalist, especially with cricket. I'm sure the family knows, Mr. President. And the story Mr. Nichols told me is that apparently the cricketer Mervyn Dillon was hit with lightning, upon which the late Prime Minister exclaimed that it had no impact whatsoever on Mr. Dillon. And in fact, he was sorry for the lightning. Finally, my last resource in this regard was my close friend, also a close friend of Senator Walcott, Mr. Ramon Allen QC, who served as a chairman under the late Prime Minister. So we have the perspective of those who were there with him in the opposition days, those who were there with him in the 2000s, and now someone, Mr. Allen QC, would have served with the late Prime Minister as a chairman, somewhat lesser down on the ranks, and certainly gave an interesting opinion in that he was harsh and demanded, and he expected excellence. However, similar to what we have heard, you could convince him to change his mind once you brought the necessary facts to support your position. I recall being in the office and hearing the said Mr. Allen prepare himself to go and face the late Prime Minister when it was budget time. And I've very rarely seen him scared, but I think that was one occasion. And you will forgive me, Mr. President, forgive me, Mrs. Arthur, when you were going in front of the short man, that's what I heard. I never called him that. That's what I heard. You had to be prepared with all your information. And so all these statements, all these accolades, and all what we hear today forms a picture of an individual who gave himself completely to the nation. As the son of someone involved in politics, I know and understand how much that would have cost you personally. And I want to thank you through Mr. President. We want to thank you. We want to thank you for his service to this nation, and may he rest in peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
President, I want to beg to move that this sitting be now suspended until 2:30 for lunch.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 2:30 p.m. today. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. The sitting is accordingly suspended until 2:30.